In this video, we will debunk 4 common misconceptions about lifting the Toyota IFS. I won't simply tell you what's right or wrong. Instead, I will show you the why and how. In the end, you understand what exactly happens and how to better choose your suspension upgrades. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome to Tinker's Adventure. I'm Kai. There are many misconceptions and myths about lifting the Toyota IFS. It's difficult to seek truth through all the opinions out there. Therefore, I will focus on the principles and mechanisms to debunk 4 most common myths. They are: you need X-inch lift to fit X-size tire. More lifts equals better off-road. Preload makes it ride stiff and flexes less. And at last, all spacers are bad. This is the second video of my 2-part video series, Everything About Toyota IFS. Don't worry if you haven't watched part 1. I included the key technical contacts in this video, so you get up to speed along the way. You can review part 1 after you watch this video for additional details. Alright, let's get started. How much lift do I need to fit 33s, 35s? This is probably the most commonly asked questions on any internet forums. Everyone has a different experience because there are just so many variables. But what if I tell you it is not about how much lift at all? As we went through in part 1 video, after lifting the IFS, the suspension will operate within the same range of wheel travel. We simply change the static equilibrium point on flat ground. Therefore, regardless of lift, the tire will still move up to the same locations during suspension travel. Your focus should be how to clear larger tires at bump stop instead of at ride height. The idea of using a lift to clear larger tires mostly comes from Jeeps with solid front axles. Their lifts usually comes with bump stop spacers to limit how far up the tire can go. At the same time, solid axles geometry allow them to add a tons of droop. Therefore, their lifts usually shift the entire range of travel downwards. For IFS, the draw bracket style lift, usually the 6-inch ones, also shift the entire range of travel downwards. Those type of lifts have their unique pros and cons, so we won't digress further. Now back to clearing larger tires. Other than the obvious metal cutting, there are a few more knobs we can turn to further increase the tire clearance. As we learned in part 1, the wheel position is controlled by the spindle. The spindle is located solely by the upper and lower control arm ball joints. So if we want to move the tire forward, ideally we'll want to shift both the upper and lower ball joints forward. Unfortunately, the factory upper ball joint is fixed. Nevertheless, the lower ball joint has the most impact because it is much closer to the wheel. To move the lower ball joint forward, we can adjust the alignment bolts. From what I measured, adjusting from neutral to max forward position, the wheel shifted 0.45 inch. The issue with this method is that it affects both caster and camber simultaneously. So you may not be able to go all the way, or you could have a bad alignment. This is where an adjustable upper control arm like the SPC can be very useful because it decouples caster and camber adjustments. Wheel offset is another knob we can turn. The more the tire sticks out, either by wheel spacers or negative offset wheels, the less clearance you have. This is because the wheel offset is located outside the steering axis. The increased scrub radius literally swings the tire into the wheel well. By playing with alignments and wheel offsets, most people can fit 33-inch tires without metal cutting. As you increase in tire size, or go for a wider stance through wheel offset, metal cutting will become inevitable. Of course, using a lift to clear the tire at ride height can reduce the occurrence of rubbing during street driving. However, it is not a clean solution and will limit your performance. More lift gives us more approach, departure, and breakover angles. It also increases the ground clearance under most part of the vehicle. All those are inarguably essential off-road. However, if you have too much lift, articulation will start to decline. There will be a point that this drawback outweighs the benefit from clearance. Let's take a closer look how it works. In part 1 video, we learned how much up and down travel the Toyota IFS has. We also learned with a 3-inch lift, it comes with 3-inch loss in down travel and 3-inch gain in up travel. Although the total suspension travel did not change, how much it will actually articulate also depends on weight distribution and suspension stiffness. To demonstrate this, I conducted some corner travel index tests before and after the suspension lift. On factory suspension, the passenger side front tire drooped 3.8 inches when it lost traction. The driver's side front wheel moved up 2.5 inches and started to compress the bump stop. Therefore, the factory IFS yielded 6.3 inches of articulation, lined up nicely with what we saw in Part 1. Now, let's see what happened after we raised the ride height by a full 3 inches. The Ironman Foam Cell Pro coilovers add 1.2 inches of droop. Yes, it is a little more than most other extended travel coilovers. So we have a net increase in total suspension travel. Now let's see if we also see an increase in articulation. The passenger side drooped 2.1 inches, pretty much within measurement error. However, the driver's side compressed only 3.7 inches, and it was not even touching the bump stop. So the total front end articulation is now 5.8 inches, a half-inch decrease from factory, even though this setup has 1.2 inches more suspension travel than factory. If this is a standard non-extended travel coilovers, we'll probably have less than 5 inches of articulation. So what the hell happened? As I mentioned earlier, the actual articulations also depends on weight distribution and suspension stiffness. In a quasi-static crawling scenario, we must achieve static equilibrium at all times, meaning total downward force must equals total upward force. As we go up the ramps, the individual wheel force changes, but their sum always equal to the weight of the vehicle. How much this suspension will compress depends on how much weight is transferred to this tire, divided by the suspension stiffness. So depending on the scenario, it may not always compress all the way to the bump stop. In comparison, the suspension is much likely to reach full droop because the wheel force will always go to zero before it lifts off the ground. This is why maintaining sufficient down travel is critical for slow speed articulations. For IFS, it is a trade-off with how much you lift. At last, I lowered the suspension by 0.8 inch and left with 2.2 inches of lift. Just out of curiosity and for due diligence, I also measured the flex in the other direction. Here's just another view of the total articulation. This time, we measure 3 inch of droop and 3.8 inch of compression. The total articulation now increased to 6.8, just a little better than factory. These numbers line up closely with our theories. The added droop roughly equals to reduction in lift, while compression almost didn't change because it is limited by weight. The lower control arm is now much closer to the bump stop, but still not touching, which means you can continue to trade lift with articulation. The choice is yours. When we swap to the other sets of wheels, I measured 2.9 inch of droop and 3.5 inch of compression. The total articulation is 6.4. The numbers are reasonably close. The discrepancy comes from interactions with the rear suspension and left to right weight transfer. Body to frame flex can also be a factor, and there is the sway bar mechanism. And of course, there is measurement errors. Here is a summary of available suspension travel versus actual articulation achieved in our CTI test. In part 1 video, I showed this last bit of up travel is in the bump stop, so 6.3 is almost as much as we can get during slow speed crawling. Although we added travel with extended coilovers, we did not increase articulation the same amount due to lift. Ground clearance and articulation are both essential off-road. You had to find your own balance based on your particular needs. One note I want to add is this GX is equipped with KDSS sway bars, which behave almost like no sway bar in this test. A Toyota with regular sway bars like this 5th Gen 4Runner will behave very differently in this CTI test. I will make a separate video to review Toyota sway bars, so please stay tuned for that. Nobody enjoys a jarring harsh ride. One common myth states high coilover preloads causes a harsh ride because it makes the suspension harder to compress. People also account less off-road articulation to high coilover preload for the same reasoning. Therefore, some people even suggest going for a higher spring rate to reduce the preload. I can understand why people intuitively have this misconception, but it is fundamentally false. For those who don't know what preload is, here's a quick demonstration. Here is a factory FJ Cruiser coilover. You can see even when the shock is fully extended, the spring around it was already compressed by over an inch. The spring force created by this pre-compression is the coilover preload. To debunk the myth about preload, we need a quick whiteboard section. Here we want to plot the relationship between wheel force versus suspension travel. At 0 force, 0 travel, the wheel is basically hanging in the air and suspension is at full droop. After the tire touches ground, it will start carrying more and more weight, so the wheel force increases. But for the first couple hundred pounds, the suspension will not compress at all. only after the wheel force exceeds the equivalent suspension preload. The suspension will then start to compress with more and more wheel force. For simplicity, let's assume this wheel carries a quarter of the vehicle weight. The ride height on this graph is basically when this line crosses weight over 4. And from ride height to full droop, that is our down travel. To compress the suspension beyond the ride height, such as hitting a bump, it takes this much force to compress this much travel. In the real world, whenever you hit the bump, the suspension will compress, then extend, then return to ride height. The slope of this straight line is the suspension stiffness I mentioned during the CTI test. It is roughly the spring rate times the motion ratio. Now let's take a look what happened when we add preload. By definition, more preload means it takes more wheel force before the suspension will compress. And because increasing the preload does not change the spring rate, therefore, the slope of a new line remains the same. We essentially shift the line upwards parallelly. As you can see, the new line crosses weight over 4 sooner. Therefore, our ride height changed. And from here to here is how much we lift. Starting at the new ride height, to compress the suspension the same amount, it takes exactly the same amount of extra force. So preload did not make the suspension harder to compress from ride height. However, if we hit a large enough bump, the suspension will compress, then extend. Oh wait, we ran out of down travel. So the wheel force will go straight to 0, which means this wheel essentially went micro-airborne. When they land back to the ground, it will see a step change in wheel force, going straight to the new preload. Only after that, the suspension will give and cushion the ride. And this is the harshness described in this myth. So the root cause is not preload making the suspension harder to compress, because it physically cannot do that. Instead, it is too much lift, causing not enough of down travel, and result in suspension top out. So this is just another bad example of too much IFS lift. And at last, let's debunk the myth that all spacers are bad. This myth originated from the very popular top-out spacers that achieve 2 to 3 inches of lift. By motion ratio, these spacers are 1 to 1.5 inch thick and got bolted on top of the factory coilover. In part 1 video, we found the factory shock has 0.6 inch of travel left when we bottom out the bump stop. But these spacers are thicker than 0.6, so they make the shock bottom out before the bump stop, and they have caused many bent shocks out in the world. The increased coilover length also make the upper control arm ball joint binds at full droop, which eventually leads to ball joint failure. However, if we only add about ½ inch of top-out spacer, it will not cause the shock to bottom out. At full droop, not only nothing will be binding, we gain 1 inch of down travel. At ride height, we gain 1 inch of lift. So if you are not looking for any more lift, this, in my opinion, is a pretty solid setup. In fact, as long as you verify how much shock travel is left at bump stop, you can use the thin top-out spacers to add down travel to any standard travel coilovers. In addition to top-out spacers, there is another type called the spring preload spacers. This spacer requires disassembling the strut and adding it to the spring, either the top or the bottom. After reassembling the strut, the spring will be under a higher preload. Some people believe this type of spacers will cause a harsh ride, but we already debunked that in the last section. Unlike the top-out spacers, the preload spacers does not change the coilover length, hence not affecting the suspension limits. However, we do need to verify the spring doesn't reach coil bind before the bump stop. The preload spacers is a great choice to add a little lift to the TRD Pro coilovers, because according to Toyota, these coilovers already have near 1 inch extra wheel travel, so even a small top-out spacer may risk binding at full droop. We just finished debunking 4 most common misconceptions about lifting the Toyota IFS. Hope you learned something new. If you couldn't follow some of the content, please go watch part 1 video where I broke down the Toyota IFS constructions, where you gain a little more technical insight. If you enjoy this type of highly technical content, please consider subscribing and share it to a friend. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.